George Kilpatrick, inspiration for the nation. Of course, this week we all were watching to see what the Minneapolis jury was going to do in the case of Derek Chauvin and his murder of George Floyd in broad daylight, broadcast around the world. And I wanted to bring in Yusuf Abdul-Qadir, activist in the Syracuse community. And he's got some news to share with y'all, if y'all don't know. We'll get to that in just a minute. But Yusuf, your reaction to the verdict, let's start with that. Guilty, guilty, guilty on all three counts.
Yeah, it's important to note two specific issues with respect to the verdict. It's important to note that, but not for the efforts of a 17-year-old Black girl, her 9-year-old sister, we wouldn't have known about what happened to George Floyd. She recorded 8 minutes and 46 seconds of what we knew now is 9 minutes of 29 seconds. And so it's important for us to center the fact that it was the people who stood by, that mobilized, that organized, that bore witness, that got the prosecution to prosecute in a way that would hold the officers to the fullest extent of the law, and therefore show what we all knew to be the case as him being guilty on all of the three counts. So it's important to start with that. It's a relief, but also kind of disconcerting that it took the entire world to get what we are talking about as justice, which really isn't justice because George Floyd will never be here. So there isn't any justice. There's some measure of accountability, perhaps. But it took the entire world and a global movement to get accountability for an officer. In many cases, we haven't seen that, whether it was Eric Garner, which was also recorded. And I don't use the term of a murder. I talk about it as a public lynching. Because it was a public lynching. Officer Chauvin stood on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, over 3 minutes, knowing that he had no pulse, because he had the power to do so. And he had the ability to say that there's nothing you're going to do. And that's the type of way that Black people and Black communities have been policed and terrorized throughout U.S. history, like a public lynching. And so I think it's important to also add to the conversation that this was more than just a murder. This was a public lynching, a state-sanctioned public lynching, as has been the types of public lynchings in histories prior in the U.S.
And as you were waiting for the verdict, take me through your emotions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard because as Black people, we're not used to seeing any mechanism of accountability, and it took a Black and, dare I say, also Muslim Attorney General and Keith Ellison, who said we're gonna prosecute to the fullest extent of the law. And it took a Black chief of police to say that his officer engaged in gross misconduct. It took several experts and police officers and witnesses and bystanders to make that moment happen. So in some sense, it's a sigh of relief, but it's also a deep sense of concern that people will allow this to make themselves go back to normalcy, whatever normalcy means, and say, well, you know, the work is done and we can go back, when in fact, as the verdict was being read, a 15-year-old was killed in Columbus, Ohio. Adam Toledo was killed last week in Chicago, and another in North Carolina, right? And so we're still seeing this issue happen, and we can't go back to what we want to accept as normalcy because it seemed that what was so egregious from Officer Chauvin was just a blip in the screen when actually is more normal than we wanted to accept it to be.
One of the things that we're hearing about this particular worldwide global movement for justice and accountability was the fact that it was all shades, right? It was everybody coming to the table, led by Black folk, but with allies, white folk as well. And I bring that into the conversation because it seems to me that there's still this idea of him causing this narrative of compliance and what was the other thing? The original crime. And I bring that up because I had a long conversation. I was in a hot tub in Florida, if you will. And when the guy found out that I was a talk show host, he started to engage me in this conversation. And it was about, well, nobody's talking about the original counterfeit $20 bill, alleged $20 counterfeit bill. And so that sent me into a whole cycle of, you know, well, what abouts, and you know, very, very, in my view, very pointedly pointing out the failures of that argument. Having said that, there is this belief in parts of white America that almost as if that there's a deservedness of some of these things. You feel me? What I'm saying about that? Like,
I tackled this particular strain in a podcast that I have produced by WAER called Afro Futures, where you can go on wherever you get your podcast, you can listen to it, and we talk about this.
Good friend Jolie, yes,
yeah, it's really, really good brother, and in this particular context, it's important to uplift the idea of broken windows policing, because this is an indictment not just on Officer Chauvin, but on the entire theory of broken windows policing. And this theory of broken windows policing is that you have to enforce every single minor infraction like a broken window, because if you don't, then entire society will disintegrate into chaos, into decay, and therefore will have so much anarchy that you have to enforce even the smallest of infractions with the fullest extent of the law in order to prevent that unseeming likelihood from occurring. And in theory, it sounds neutral, but in practice, it's never neutral, because in practice, it's intimately related with the roots of policing as an institution, which is really white supremacy, the preservation of policing Black bodies, and really the maintenance of a racial caste system. So broken windows policing with white supremacist culture mixed with a warrior cop mentality is why you're going to see these outcomes. And so we have to be careful, because what was really, quite frankly, and as you put it accurately, right, an allegation of a $20 counterfeit bill was leveraged to justify a public lynching. But Dylan Roof killed 9 people in a church, right? Kyle Rittenhouse had an AR-15 or whatever the automatic rifle that he had.
It was an AR-15. You're right about that, yeah.
Killed 2 individuals in Kenosha, Wisconsin. The police drove by him and gave him water, right? And in the case of Dylan Roof, after killing 9 individuals at a Black church in South Carolina, took him to Burger King. Somehow, you know, he was hungry. You know, this young boy, this young man, somehow, you know, that was totally okay, and he could live to go to trial. But George Floyd couldn't live and had the life snuffed out of them for the allegation where he was presenting no actual threat. And so I think it's really important to really disrupt that narrative entirely.
Right, this idea of this compliance, and then you have the Ma'Khia Bryant situation, right? And you spoke of her earlier, and this, but there is this idea in the minds of, and this is being perpetrated, is that the right word? Promoted very heavily in right-wing talk media, Fox News, and all of the likes. This idea of, well, if they just comply, like the soldier in I forgot where this was. Was this Virginia? Yeah.
Virginia.
The in uniform, right? This idea that he was compliant, but then he wanted to be into a safe space, and he was still terrorized in that moment. And so when does it end? And you say, as you point out, in all those particular instances, there wasn't any of this. There was, in fact, for those individuals, there was more like excuses. Right? This sort of thing. I think this is also.
Well, earlier this week, an individual hit police officers with his car, right?
Right.
And so, like, he's literally assaulting police, and there's no question about whether or not he should comply, right? Like, he is assaulting them. And we can see this through video over and over and over again, where individuals are fighting police. There was a white woman who, you know, refused to get out of her vehicle. She didn't die. She wasn't killed. And so there's this notion that, and Talana Jones is a good friend of mine, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, raises a question, and I asked her this question in a conference that we had last weekend about compliance. What if you're deaf, right? What if you have a developmental disability? And what does compliance mean when you're disabled, right? What if you physically are handicapped and you can't actually move, right? So you can't comply in the way, so it's not just racist, and the way that it's expressed, it's also ableist in that it presumes the individual has the capacity to comprehend or the physical capability to actually comply. But at the end of the day, this compliance excuse is really nothing but an excuse to justify extrajudicial state-sanctioned violence against Black bodies.
Yusuf, former director of the New York chapter of Civil Liberties Union in Syracuse, And so as I think about what you're saying, and as I process that on the national scale, this idea of the policing of Black bodies, and it leads me to this question. You and I think, disagree on this, but I'll bring it up anyway.
Yeah.
You believe that the police state, well, policing as it is should be abolished. Do you believe in that? I mean, is that your position?
Yeah, I believe policing, and I think there's an excessive amount of evidence to show that policing as we understand it today, that results in the types of outcomes that we see, ought to not exist, because it does not produce the type of outcomes that we have been sold to believe that it would produce. It has not made us safer. We like to say that it has, but it doesn't. It isn't the best practice. We're the only people in the world who are doing this. Somehow no one else in the world has this problem except us. So yeah, it ought to be abolished as we know it, because as we know it, it was designed to maintain slavery. That's legitimately what it was designed to do.
Right. And so is it theoretical? Is it practical? I mean, if we woke up today, and this is our, I just want to engage you because I think people need to understand this point of view. If we were to wake up today and the Syracuse police, we're going to pivot to Syracuse in a minute. Mm-hmm. If that police force, if every officer resigned today and there was no system, if you will, to enforce the law, if you will, you'll be okay with that?
I think that's the problem with how we're talking about this conversation, right? Yeah. Like mm-hmm. the understanding, and different communities will take different approaches, and different theorists talk about this in various different ways. The idea of defunding the police is about removing the size, scope, and power of law enforcement, because they're entirely too many parts of our lives. You mentioned the Army lieutenant in Virginia. Right. Should they have even stopped him in the first place? Why do we need police to do that? Right. So that's an example. Like, they don't need to be there. That's not a thing that they need to do. Do police need to enforce having a air freshener hanging from your rearview mirror, as was the case with Dante Wright? Why do we need police to do that? Why do we need armed individuals to show up for that? Mm-hmm. What is the role, the value that they're adding that couldn't be served by something else? And so this is what we're talking about.
Is law enforcement a necessary part of a democracy?
I think the way that we have acculturated ourselves as a society, in a culture that's riddled with white supremacist racial structures as we do, it has become the mode that we've accepted. But I don't think, and I think we ought to imagine a beloved community that creates a circumstance that we don't actually need these things. And we've only accepted, especially as Black people, because I think it's important for us to remember that it's not all Black people don't agree on this, right? Like, we're both Black, and so we have different perspectives on this.
Right.
But Black people were very involved in the crack cocaine epidemic in the context of asking for more law enforcement, right? And I think there's a necessity for us to own that reality. And I think many people have regretted that, because in hindsight, that really wasn't their intention. We've only ever been given what we've been given. If we knew that we had the option that white people who are heroin addicts have to get treatment and care, then we may have asked for that. That's what this looks like, right? What it looks like is not only always reverting to these types of massive infusion into the carceral state, when we can take a public health approach in most instances.
Yeah, I love this idea of public health approach, and yet it brings me back to something you said earlier, or at least alluded to, if we're concerned about Black bodies, right? Mm-hmm. First, we have to say that we are concerned about Black bodies, or put very simply, that Black lives do indeed matter. And the evidence suggests that until things are affecting white communities, and I think that's I think Chris Cuomo awkwardly said that to some extent, and what he said, but we've seen that evidence of that. Until it hits communities where I live, quite frankly, it's not given the attention.
Yeah, and I think what it looks like is what it looks like in white communities, right? Like, in white communities, when you're going through a mental health crisis, generally, you're not going to be faced with, unless you're a person of color, as was the case with Judson Album and Janesville DeWitt, you're not going to be faced with the types of things we had. And in fact, we saw a few months ago in Liverpool, New York, which is a suburban community outside of Syracuse. When it doesn't look like it's recorded. Okay.
It
is now.
Yes.
So what we saw in Liverpool, New York, is a circumstance whereby an individual several months ago, where they had a standoff with law enforcement, right? And they were armed, and that individual lived and survived, right? So
Hmm.
this looks like what happened in that circumstance. And contrast that to Justin Alveham, a person who has Middle Eastern descent, right? That individual didn't live,
Mm.
right? A person who had ideation of suicide, who there was a known mental health crises, didn't live those circumstances. And too often, people of color, not just Black people, but mostly Black people, but brown people, Indigenous people, Asian Americans, and sometimes marginalized poor white people experience law enforcement differently than wealthier, suburban, more well-to-do individuals. And so they can be brought to mental health treatment, they can be brought to rehab, they can be brought to other types of public health approaches, and we get 9 minutes and 29 seconds of a knee on our back for an allegation of a counterfeit $20 bill. That's what we're talking about. And if you don't think that that ought to be abolished, then I'm not certain if we're really fully appreciating the way that law enforcement has increased in every facet of our lives in ways that empirically provide no public benefit. And that's largely because the police unions have had an oversized authority. And I'm a union supporter. My mother was in a union. My oldest brother was in a union. And so in theory, I support unions. And in practice, I think they're an important aspect of society because of collective bargaining and collective action. But the job of a police union isn't necessarily to make communities safe. The job of the police union is to keep police officers employed.
Mm.
And that may not necessarily mean towards a public benefit. That may oftentimes mean at the expense of the public, especially when you have officers who engage in gross misconduct. It's the job of the union to have contracts that do not have the ability for there to be accountability. And that's where we ought to be playing a lot of focus. And in Syracuse in particular, as the current administration has just arbitrated an agreement with the police union that looks very much like what they did a few years ago, that really has very little accountability, that basically says you got to live in the city for 5 years and we'll give you a slush fund to do what you want. It's a lot more than just that, right? And so when we ask the mayor about whether or not officers should be fired for sexual misconduct, for sexual assault, and he agreed to negotiate that, and he hasn't done that, there's a question as to whether or not why isn't that the case?
I'm glad you brought that up because I was just on a 6-hour training about the underreported nature of sexual assault, sexual violence by law enforcement, particularly police. There's a particular situation here, right, in Syracuse. Would you just give us a little background on that, just to give people some context?
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily legal until recently for an individual who had sexual assault, right, in the way that we know it, whether it's rape, etc. That wasn't even deemed, when it was an officer doing so, to be sexual assault. There's no way that could not be sexual assault. The officer has a tremendous amount of power to be able to use force, including deadly force, right? Mm. And that power dynamic, when an officer engages in sex with an individual in their custody, for not to be deemed to be an abuse of power is it's just an abomination. It's completely absurd and ridiculous. And in Syracuse, we had an officer who was a serial sexual assaulter, who in fact, in the case of Maletra, who was a woman, Afro-Latina in Syracuse, who alleged being sexually assaulted by an officer. In fact, an officer who sexually assaulted her in front of her child, her baby child, after she had recently given birth, right? That officer still kept his job and wasn't prosecuted, and was able to go through the force for 20 years knowingly, because of the realities of how the power police unions are to defend this individual, to still stay on the job, to have the power and authority that we entrust with law enforcement. And these are the realities that often happen. So there's often underreporting generally of sexual assault instances, of sexual violence against women and others. But when you're in law enforcement, it's a particularly devastating reality that hasn't been adjudicated adequately.
And I learned that not only does it get underreported by the individuals, but even as you point out, the adjudication of it and how the policing agencies actually code that situation. They don't even call it that, even in most cases, right? So it's very. In fact, I learned that it was actually very difficult to even compile statistics on this particular type of abuse in policing because of the way it's coded. They code it differently, like conduct unbecoming or some other type of
Which
language.
can mean, which could basically mean cursing an individual, right? Like,
Right. So I wanted to just take a sidebar on that in particular because it's an issue that we'll probably have to deal with more. All right, so let's move now to Syracuse police reform. You were part of the Spark. I believe you're part of that
yes,
that
yep,
movement. What's it stand for? Syracuse Police Accountability and Reform Commission.
coalition,
Coalition. All right,
yep,
got it.
yep.
So, given what we heard from what appears to be happening in this country, or at least we hope is happening, I understand that this group and all the people who marched all over from the summer till now, uh, the demands are increasing, or at least what you asked for in terms of reforms from Mayor Walsh in the city. And let's talk about the city in particular. But I have another ask of you as we think about this, Yusuf.
Yeah.
Why, as you think about where we are with reforms, give us where you think we are with that. But also, why aren't other agencies being held to the same sort of standard as the city? Why isn't the county and the sheriff's department being held to this same kind of thing? Why isn't the state police like, why is it just the city that has to or appear to be doing what it needs to do when the other jurisdictions don't seem to have that kind of pressure? Maybe, and that's my perception. Help me with that. So
I'm gonna tackle that question first. It's important to understand that this is about police accountability, but it's about transforming the relationship between law enforcement and the community that they serve. But really, most importantly, it's about power building, right? And an exercise and an endeavor in power building is about understanding a power analysis and understanding what levers you have capacity to do things in and how you need to build towards executing a task, right? So, for instance, there are major national issues that are happening. And we can try to go to the Congress, which has 50-50, but you need 60 votes.
right.
Or you can try to deal with it at the local level where you actually have more ability to address with your local city council than you will have with Congress, right? So we can try police reform on a national level, which will perhaps maybe not likely reflect the type of reform that we really need, or we can go directly to those that are directly in relation to us, our city councils. And it's because we had been organizing and building power and doing work in Syracuse, that is why that was our focus. And again, we're the Syracuse Police Accountability and Reform Coalition, not Onondaga County, not New York State. That was our focus. And until we win that fight, we feel that we need to win there before we can begin to go other places. It's not that we don't talk about the other areas, but that's our focus, and that's where we build expertise and understanding the policies and practice, and that's where the organizing efforts have been directed. And so,
yeah, I was going to say, but the perception is they get to skate while all the pressure's on the city. I just wanted to give you that perception.
And I understand that, and I hear that, and there's ample work to be done at the county level. And when we are having the ability to have the capacity to impact the county and the county sheriff's office specifically, because that's the other misnomer, is that people don't understand that the county sheriff, who has authority over the sheriff's department, that entity is an independently elected entity.
Yes,
right. The way you could effectuate that is voting out the county sheriff, right? And when there's an election and voting him out, that's one mechanism to do so. And we are building power towards that. We are educating people about the distinction between that. The chief of police in Syracuse, though, is a political appointee who the mayor of Syracuse has authority over. The mayor can hire, he can fire, he can adjudicate, the common council can fund or not fund the operations, can call him to answer. There's a different power structure and mechanism that we have that we don't necessarily have in the county sheriff's office department. So that, I think it's important to make that distinction.
Okay.
And as it relates to the organizing efforts from last summer to now, no, the mayor hasn't maintained the agreements that he has committed to in the way that we believe. The mayor likes to present himself as this massive reformer. And how this relates to the Chauvin trial is that the Chauvin trial wasn't a a master class in use of force policy, in understanding what reasonableness is and what a reasonable officer can do and the tremendous amount of discretion and the use of force policy that allowed, that prohibited Officer Chauvin, because that's how he was found guilty, right? Because the policy, this is antithetical to the policy, so therefore it's not reasonable. It's antithetical to the training, and so therefore it's not reasonable. And that's why we attack the use of force policy in Syracuse, because the officers are given so much discretion that a jury can determine that they were reasonable if the policy says that these are reasonable actions and the training provides the ability for you to reasonably presume that you can use such force. So the use of force policy in Syracuse is grossly inadequate because it gives entirely too much discretion. And the mayor wants to present that we have changed it in a way that presents a national model when in fact it really doesn't, because we've done the research for them. We did a national research. We looked at best practices. We came up with a matrix for them that said, here's your language. Here's the language of 5 other jurisdictions. You can literally cut and paste. And they haven't done that. And so anything short of that is putting lipstick on a pig. And as I've said time and time again, I am not Kermit the Frog. I am not kissing Miss Piggy. That is not going to replace the realities that we ought to accept in Syracuse. And they want us to accept that.
All right. Yeah. So one, the mayor has not delivered on a use of force policy. Just call it right, straight up.
Has not. Okay. And the same thing with body camera policy, because what we saw was a body camera that showed and corroborated what the footage of that 17-year-old young woman filmed, right? So the body camera footage was used. But what if Officer Chauvin was able to write his report based on the comments, so he can basically cover up his behavior and begin to create a narrative that justifies the action? That's why we talked about body camera policy, because body camera policy is body cameras are only as useful as the policy is reflective of the demand of public trust. And so the body camera policy is inadequate. We talked about militarized police force, right? They didn't demilitarize the police force. In fact, they got more armored vehicles and more police technology and equipment from military-grade technologies. And so they haven't done the things that they want to rhetorically say they've done and kind of say that we've completed the race and say, well, if you compare us to other administrations, yeah, they have done more than other administrations, but that's because other administrations haven't actually started the race. Imagine I was a relay racer. Imagine that we're doing a 4x1 and the gun shoots and you start running and you take 5 steps and you call the race done. Just because you showed up to the race and you started running doesn't mean you've completed the race. That means you've just started.
Right.
They haven't even ran a lap before they said the race is done. And we've won the race because no one else showed up to the track. That's why you run the race, but you didn't actually complete it. And so I think it's important for us to understand that on a number of areas, they haven't completed the task and they haven't risen to the moment that we find ourselves in.
So it sounds to me like you said, the biggest issue is 1, lack of a use of force policy. 2, lack of body cameras for everybody, because we hear the promises. The promise is that the body cameras will be at some point and we're phasing them in and we've ordered them. That's what I heard. Is that what you heard?
Yes, but it's also the policy that dictate the use of body cameras. When a camera would be turned on, right? Where it would be stored, where the public have access to that footage. Let's take Daniel Prude in Rochester, right? The only reason why we knew about Daniel Prude in Rochester is because people foiled to get the footage.
Right.
And then they got the footage and they saw what happened, right? If you left it to the report, nothing, even in the Chauvin trial, if you left it to the Minneapolis Police Department's report of what happened, it was an accident, nothing went wrong.
Right.
So you can't go by the officers reporting because they're not honest in those reports.
I'm glad you said that. So, because what did I hear them say? If we have the cameras on all the time, then it would cost too much money or something like that. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, I mean, that's what they said. But I think that they have been able to find money for lots of things for police.
Gotcha. So what we're struggling with then is to have the cameras are there. Not everybody has them yet, but even for those that do have them, it's not the reforms that you're asking for regarding how we can see it, where it's going to be stored, who can see it, et cetera. Is that what I'm understanding?
Officers, are they going to be disciplined for not following the policy, et cetera?
Well, what's interesting is as you point out, no one's really saying anything. Not no one is anything. I don't hear a lot of conversation around the filing false reports, right?
Hmm.
Where they're covering up some of these instances when you see what they wrote versus what the video said happened. Isn't that like something that should be
Which is a part of the policy that we're talking about, right? Like
okay?
the
Okay,
officer should not, the officer should independently write the report so that we can verify through the footage. And if the officer is being dishonest, they should be disciplined.
right.
And
Great.
that is not something that is necessarily fully captured in policy.
Are there any things that you think that the city is delivering on regarding the reform of police?
I think that they're taking some efforts, and I think it's important to give credit where it's due. They're taking some efforts to begin to think about restructuring the way that police respond to 911 calls when a person is experiencing a mental health crisis.
Mm.
But it's still, again, grossly inadequate because there's a fundamental lack of understanding of what police ought to be doing. You know, I think it's important for the public to understand that when we foiled 911 data, and the vast majority of calls for police aren't for violent instances, right? Like they're for like things that police really probably shouldn't be doing. So why are we asking them to do it? Should we have other people do it? And shouldn't those other people be paid to do it? You know, and shouldn't we not be paying an armed individual to show up for a fire, for instance? I mean, there's a number of things that police show up to that they ought to not be showing up to.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. As you were speaking, it occurred to me that you have now created situations in our community where if people wanted to call the police, now they have to wonder if by calling the police, they're not only putting themselves at risk or whether they're putting their loved one at risk. Now, again, I'm not for the abolishment necessarily, but I am for the restructuring, and I appreciate that. But it's a real, what anguish someone might have. I heard a survivor of sexual assault say that they didn't want to call the police because they didn't want the system to be involved. And yet they were victimized at the same time and didn't feel that they could get that relief through law enforcement because of the fear of what might happen to the person that caused them harm. That's a trip, man.
It is, and it's with sexual assault victims. It's with individuals who are calling the police who are needing support. I mean, you had a 70-something-year-old man who was killed 2 years ago who experienced a mental health crisis, and he was shot dead. He had dementia. He was handicapped.
On the South Side, I recall that.
I don't think he's a threat to anyone, but yet he doesn't exist any longer. And if you think there was a case of the other day that I just saw on Instagram where it's like on Now This, so it's verified. You can look it up. Where you had a family who had a food truck, and the manager of the kitchen where they store their food basically showed up with an All Lives Matter shirt and got into a confrontation and pulled out a gun, right, on this Black couple. And not only did he pull out the gun, the man had to like hold him down for literally 11 minutes. And his wife was like, I don't know if I want to call the police because they may kill my husband. And she begged them, right? She begged them. And as you look at the footage, the police take him and put him in handcuffs, right? He didn't do anything. He's literally trying to save himself and his wife. This individual has a gun. And guess what? That individual was released the next day. And so again, if he were a Black person, he might have been shot dead or been put under the jail, right? And not necessarily been released. And this is why we talk about the duplicitous nature of the way that our policing and carceral system operates.
What do we need to do, Yusuf, to make sure, I guess it's a rhetorical question. I'll ask it this way or get you to comment this way. We can't take, basically what I'm hearing you say is that one guilty verdict, does that mean we can take our foot off the pedal for reform and making sure that what we've been marching for is that the reform that we want and that we desperately need, including in your view, the dismantling of the system, and I get you on that, that we gotta keep the pressure on is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to use, unfortunately, this moment in the way that the Emmett Till lynching galvanized a new iteration of the civil rights movement, right? And to go beyond a single item or a single moment as the solution to long structural problems, but to continue to begin to demand. And I think what we often forget is that they are public servants, right? That like they literally work for us, and we have accepted a circumstance where we are subservient to them, right? And in the context of Syracuse, where 95% of the police literally don't live in this community, it isn't just about residency, it's about extracting tens of millions of dollars of resources out of Syracuse to subsidize suburban communities so that police can come into Syracuse, can criminalize, can incarcerate, can impoverish, and can do harm to Black and brown members who in a city that has the highest concentration of poverty amongst Black and Latinos in the country. And that's our reality. And I think we ought to begin to think about, is this what should be acceptable? How do we actually imagine a different reality? And I think we deserve better, and we are owed better, and we should expect and demand better. And so this fight doesn't end. This is honestly really just the beginning.
Yusuf Abdul-Qadir, you just posted something recently on Facebook about your future. What do you have to tell the audience?
Yeah, it is bittersweet that I am moving out of Syracuse. I'm moving to Baltimore, Maryland. I'm going to be working for Facebook as a product policy manager, which is basically I provide product counseling and a whole host of other support for new products and product launches for Facebook that addresses the issues that I deeply care about. Issues around climate change, issues around lifting Black voices, issues around racial justice, issues around misinformation spreading on the platform and on the products that it owns. And Syracuse is always, I mean, I've spent my adult life in Syracuse. I left to work at the UN, but came back because I care deeply about this community, and I'm not going to stop supporting Syracuse. I'm still going to be involved in Spark, but it is certainly bittersweet. And so I want to say to folks as I transition that there's so many tremendous leaders in Syracuse, young people, especially people like TJ Davis, people like Saria Rahim, people like Shukri Muhammad, people like Twiggy Billieu, people like Mered Billieu. There's so many amazing bright stars that are doing this work. And if you go to spark315.org, SPAARC315.org, you can look at the work they're doing and support them. But know that this work ought to continue because Syracuse is really the ground zero of all these issues, whether it's with respect to poverty, whether it's with respect to segregation, 81. If we can do it in Syracuse, it can have a huge impact around the nation. And in fact, we have had impact on the nation in the past, whether it's through our abolition history, whether it's through our racial justice work, our women's rights movement in Central New York and Seneca Falls. And we can really be the epicenter for how to address these issues that can have an effect around the country.
Well, Yusuf Abdul-Qadir, we thank you for your work in the community in collaboration with those names that you mentioned. We wish you success. And we know that we haven't heard the last from you, because I'm sure you'll pop up every now and then on Sirius XM or CNN or someplace. But more importantly, we hope you pop up back here to keep us updated as to what's going on with you. Thank you for your work, brother, and continued success. And I hope that, I know you're in a period of fasting. I hope that that is going well as well. I don't know what the word is. Do you say happy something? I don't know if there's any of that.
Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan Mubarak.
Thank you very much.
For the nation.